I want to begin by talking about art as a visual language, because when you study art, when people take design classes, they learn all the basic elements, color, texture, shape, line. You can break down an image, you can break down a painting into all these various components and then put it back together. But it's important to learn the construction or the various components that make paintings. So like in this Kandinsky, it's pretty much what's considered non-objective art. So it's not supposed to look like anything, but it does fall upon, balance, harmony, looking for those kind of components. Same thing with any picture, like in this Van Gogh, there's a sense of movement. It still has a reference to nature, but these are all very personal decisions. And then like in this painting by Fontaine-Latour, you start to get more of a sense of realistic space. It looks believable. And when you start as a student, I've been teaching for 35 years here in Fort Wayne and elsewhere. One of the most exciting things I do is when I teach basic drawing, because when you take a flat piece of paper and you start to teach about linear perspective and you create the illusion of three dimensions. And to me, it's always been magical. So this is Raphael's School of Athens, which is in Rome. And here you have this sense of really deep space. And I think once you start understanding the components of art, of visual art as a language, it gives you absolute freedom to do whatever you want. Some of you may have seen this painting. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's by Caillebotte, The Rainy Streets of Paris. But then as you get into personal expression, it's a crapshoot. It's everything can go. Anything goes, everything goes. This is a painting by Francis Bacon, who was a British painter, who's actually quoting Rembrandt. The Sides of Beef was a Rembrandt painting. The figure of that's Pope Innocent X, interpreted, because he's copying Velázquez, who did a portrait of Pope Innocent, and he's combining these things. So as art gives you freedom to express, you can do just about anything, and you'll see things that are traditional, you'll see things that are more expressive, like this Fuseli. This is titled The Nightmare. Or this painting, which is a picture of Dorian Gray, which is also the Art Institute of Chicago. So personal expression is pretty broad, as is the subject of beauty. So originally, when I was asked to talk, I know beauty was supposed to be a component, but I did see there's something as separations or differences as objective beauty and subjective beauty. So objective beauty would be, the obvious. You have nature, you have things like a flower, the dahlia, you have the waterfall, very obvious. And you see it in art too. You see the figure. The figure has always been like the ideal, or the person, the human body has been an image of creation, certainly, but also of beauty, the beautiful figure. Everyone knows this painting. Has anyone ever seen this in person? Stood in line behind everyone and held up your camera? Yeah. Mona Lisa. It still compels people, even, this day, 500 years later. This is not a painting. Recently the critic, or not the critic, the journalist Tucker Carlson, I don't know if you know who he is. He said, he has this great quote where he said that no painting in the Louvre is as beautiful as his dog's face. And I think he's right. This is our dog. It's our dog, Emma, who unfortunately is going through chemotherapy as we speak. So poor little Emma. But, that's a subjective beauty. Everyone's child is the most beautiful. Everyone's home is the most beautiful. So it's a very slippery term when you get into beauty. This is a great quote from Keats, from his poem, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, and that is all ye know on earth and all you need to know." But I do think the key point is that there's a connection between beauty and truth, that you see something that's universal, something that rings true to you. This little diagram is based on a quote by a critic, Peter Gay, and he said that art is like a stool. And if you think of it as a three-legged stool, you can understand a little bit better. The first leg is technical or technique on the far left. So that would include learning how to put something together so it doesn't fall apart or so it lasts for ages. Virtuosity, learning how to do something really well as an artist, as a painter, as a draftsman. The second one is the historical on the far right. So the historical covers this broad range of cultures and times so that you can learn what people have done from the past so that you're not reinventing the wheel. And that's what gives artists breadth. It gives them an expanse. Earlier, Ed was talking about if you have a son or a daughter who's interested in art, I would encourage them to develop their technical skills first and expose them to as much art as possible, especially going to museums. I'll show you in a few minutes why that was important to me growing up, and especially if you live here in Fort Wayne, we're in proximity to some really great collections. But the middle leg I find is the most interesting, which is the private. And the private can also be the personal. That's the component that makes the artist unique. So when you look at a Van Gogh, it stands out as a Van Gogh. Or if you look at a Grunwald or whoever, you look at them, there's something that's so personal about their work, but that's just because everyone is uniquely different. So that's the value of art, I think, is that personal aspect. So as an artist, I've gone through school and I've been teaching, but I find that it's very important to try to develop my own personal aesthetic because everyone is unique. Now, I grew up in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. I'm very proud to be from Cleveland. Similar to Ed, I did not have a lot of culture. This is a family photo from around 1958. I was born in 58. And my father worked in the steel mills in Cleveland. My mother was just a homemaker. I shouldn't say just, she was a homemaker. She was a great homemaker. I had a brother and sister who were twins, who were older than me. And even back then, it's odd looking back, thinking, it's my father had no culture. We had no art in the house. None of them they actually never went to college, so they had none of that kind of cultural exposure. And I'm thinking of how that compares to our daughter and, my life now. If you come in our home, you see so much art you're bombarded with. But the one thing my parents did have was the church. So my parents were reverent and very loyal Roman Catholics. So I grew up in a Roman Catholic home. In school, was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church in the inner city of Cleveland. So I grew up in Cleveland, and the little church is still standing, even though it's a shell of what it used to be, called Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And you can see here that it appealed to a Slovak community. It was built in 1903. But I remember as a child even looking up at the ceiling and seeing these paintings. These are actually the exact paintings I saw as a child. And just being inspired by something beyond, but also the image of God, the image of saints. It's something that was not only beautiful, but it had a reality to it. There was a spiritual reality. So the church is still standing, even though, like I said, it's nothing compared to what it used to be. This is an award I won in the 5th grade for excellent in the art program. And it's signed by Sister Kathleen and Sister John Vianney. She was the principal of our school. So anyways, I grew up, I had a lot of encouragement from teachers, and I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art. So again, this is Providence, I say, that, I grew up in the city, which had this cultural environment. The Cleveland Institute of Art is about 140 years old. It's a private school. And it was a great experience. I got my BFA from there in painting. I wanted to be a painter. And one of the beautiful things about this is that across the street from the Institute is the Cleveland Museum of Art. And the Cleveland Museum of Art is one of the great American museums. So weekly, I would cross the street and I would go and just, soak in all this great art that I was looking at. So that's what I said earlier about the historical, how that helps to shape the artist, the individual. I went on to graduate school at the University of Illinois in Champaign, had a wonderful time, got my MFA there. And when I was graduating, my advisor called me up and he said, "How would you like to teach here?" And I had no plans. I had no plans whatsoever. Of course, I said yeah. So I ended up teaching there for 2 years, moved to Chicago. I lived there for a couple of years, and then I moved here in 1989. So as I was saying about the stool, the analogy of the private, the technical, and the historical, I want to go into some elements that I think make my art what it is, and if I could try to dissect it and show what I'm interested in. One thing is symmetry. This is a painting called Summer Gate. It's a kind of an analogy of summer. But I don't know why in design class they tell you never put something directly in the center of a page, because they say it's too static. But I find the contrary. I think it actually forces you to scrutinize and to compare the two sides more deliberately. So you'll see this used quite a bit in my work. I don't know why, I just feel drawn to it, like this painting of the Four Seasons, where you're faced to flip and compare. So the staticness never bothered me. I still don't find it an objection. This painting called Gottedienst. Animals, I've found some kind of appeal to animals. I can't put my finger on it. This painting is called Passing Through. It's kind of an analogy of life. I heard one pastor say that life is like a bird. You're flying through one window and out the other window. That it's so temporal, it's so brief. It's just like this passing bird through a home. And even in this painting, you can see the tomatoes are going from green to red. So there's this sense of time, the sense of movement in the painting. This is a recent painting called The River Flow. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a cat who's floating down the ice on the river. Footstool, this is a painting I did. There was a period 30 years ago, so like 94, I think, or around 2000, where I was using toys. I was going to thrift stores and I was finding animals and model kits, and I was using them as props in my painting. So, for example, in this one, I found all these great farm animals and came home from the flea market and put them, in an actual still life and wanted to paint them. I thought there was merit in that. And then my ode to the squirrel. I finally made peace with the squirrel. We used to have a black walnut tree in our backyard. And I'd be out there throwing walnuts at the squirrel, and we finally cut the tree down. But I just, and my sister loves squirrels too, so I kind of made this for my sister, but that's my tribute. Life events shape who you are as an artist as well. In 1999, my wife and I became parents, and we both became parents late in life. Our daughter was adopted from Guatemala, and when I was walking her around, I was on sabbatical that fall, and just walking her through our neighborhood, we live in a historic neighborhood, I started to see things differently. And maybe it's parenthood, or I don't know what it is, but I started to see the beauty in the neighborhood and the homes. For example, look at the home behind the stroller. That home there turned into this painting. Because I started walking around looking at images thinking, well, what if I saw a Tang horse in the window of this house? And I don't know if you know what a Tang horse is, but the Tang dynasty was one of the premier periods in Chinese ceramics, where they did these beautiful sculptures, usually horses and figures. And it was just an irony of seeing one in a home, walking by, seeing one of these Tang horses. This is owned by the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, by the way. Again, walking along, this is Forest Park. Is anyone here from Fort Wayne? If you know Forest Park Boulevard, it's this big historic parkway. And this is a home on Forest Park. And I was walking my daughter and just saw this vignette that turned into this painting. So seeking or gaining inspiration just by walking around and seeing life, just seeing it differently, or seeing it more as like a new eye, kind of fresh. This painting's called Trick or Treat. It was done around Halloween. I thought it was ironic when they had this cheap little paper cat stuck on the door, like a cheap little decoration. And this beautiful home, this beautiful mansion, still there. This is a fairly recent, it's almost an interpretation of the last painting 23 years later, just seeing what I see walking around. The symmetry again. This one almost pits neighbor against neighbor with the pool, one house has a pool, the other one doesn't, so there's a little rivalry there as well. Another thing I find inspiration with, I guess you can say that symmetry is kind of connected to classical and neoclassical art, but I've always had an interest in classical art, especially in sculpture, in statuary. So you'll see images like statues, like this is called above, like the angel, the temples, the structures in the background, formal gardens, steps to dawn. Rendered to Caesar. This is the painting I did a couple years ago, where I wanted to squeeze in not only the biblical quote, but I wanted to squeeze in the labyrinth and just these different components, kind of referencing Roman culture, and again my fondness for statuary. So as I work too, I find inspiration in a lot of these things, and I don't try to make everything connect the dots. So I don't really worry about, okay, this is going to mean that, and this is going to mean that. So I approach it more poetically. I have a sense of what I want it to look like as an image in terms of color, and I don't worry about meaning so much. So I'm just kind of trusting God, I guess. I'm just doing it, hoping that there's some kind of benefit in the end. Not to say that there aren't some of these pieces I'll show you that are intentional, which leads me to allegory and narrative. Narrative, or I should say allegory, a story or picture using symbols to convey meaning. So there was a period too where I was using actual objects, and I was trying to say, okay, this means this and this means that. Like in this painting is called Battle and Shadows. And it was basically based off of Proverbs 4:23, which says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So that was very important because I was thinking about the heart. What is the heart? The heart is like the mind. People can't really put their finger on what is the heart. You know what the heart is? No. I don't either. Does anybody know?
The seat of faith.
The seat of faith. So in essence, what I've done too is I have this, again, using props that I was finding, toys. I have this tank. You can see the heart. The blank piece of paper was supposed to represent the mind or the heart because it's blank and the pencil, but there's a sense of protection, there's a sense of guarding it from forces from the outside, the shadows, the lights, the ominous light socket. That's kind of a joke. It's not really scary. It's not really scary, but I wanted to get that sense of movement. Again, using toys, I found this flock of model birds, and I just thought they were really interesting. So I put them on a tabletop, but I did think about how it relates to the church and how we all assemble and, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together. So that's kind of a stretch, I realize, but this one's a little more obvious. This one's called Font. And I was thinking of the soul escaped in Psalm 124. So you can see the bird, but I use the bird bath, but it's intentional that the bird bath is 8-sided because I wanted it to be the reference of baptism, that there was a sense of it being freed, and you can see the Trinitarian, there is a triangle directly above. So even though these paintings may be a bit obtuse, or there may be hidden meaning, I still find that's important to me, that it isn't too obvious. And I'll get into that in a minute, why that's important. This is maybe a little more blatant. This is my painting, The Sign of Jonah. I have some other images later on that are more overtly religious, I should say, or Christian or liturgical. But I wanted to do a painting that told the narrative of Jonah kind of in one image, in one fell swoop. So I don't know if you can see this, but there is the vase, which is actually a fish. And if you can see, there's an eye in the upper right of the fish, or the vase, I should say. So it's meant to be a vertical fish, his head. There is a figure who's going down. That's poor Jonah. And then the flowers represent his resurrection. So it is trying to portend or show, Christ's death and resurrection. And what's interesting is, I have a different career track than Ed. I've done commissions. I haven't done as many as Ed. My goal was more to not only go into teaching, but to approach galleries. So I've been showing in New York for 25 years. I have a gallery in Chicago. So these go out into the public, but I do hope that there's some kind of message. Like when I had a show in New York around 2000, this critic Garrett Henry actually picked that up. And this is a review that was in Art in America, where he talks about Christian symbols, huge sunflowers, he describes it. Jonah was, of course, and eventually scourged. The sign of Jonah may have to do with Jesus' description of Jonah as a prefigurement of his own death and resurrection. Thus, the radiant sunflowers and so on. So I was happy that at least somebody picked up on the meaning. Because I do tend, I'll get into it in a minute why I feel it's important to be a little more veiled. This is the Visible Man. This might be one of the last of the toy paintings, but I actually wanted this to be a resurrection painting. So there is that sense of the figure, the male figure. The box was the tomb. The apple meant the fruit of temptation that Adam fell. There's a compass, which represents judgment. The glue is restoration. The window is supposed to represent mourning. So there's a sense of the fall, not only the fall, but also the resurrection. And so I was trying to find meaning in normal objects and common things, even, low objects, toys and whatnot. And I was doing all these from observation, too. I was setting these up in my studio and painting them. This one is based on Luke 18. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Which I think is still a really ominous and scary question. It'll always be until Christ returns. So I did try to represent what in essence is somebody's heart. This is kind of corny, but it's somebody's heart who's waiting, who's persistent, who's, in fellowship with the Lord. So the walls are almost like this passionate hot pink. So it's almost a sign of passion. It's radiant. This flower is blooming, contrasted to the outside. Because the outside world, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a clothesline with, implies, that the world is transient. The body, your soul's going to leave the body eventually. That's where they're moving. And then on the right, this tree is being pruned. I don't know if you can see that. There's a ladder. So there's a sense of judgment eventually. The windows are dark on one house. There's a light on the other. Who's awake and who's asleep and so on. So there was an intent to show and include all of these things. I also did a large drawing of this, similar to that. There was a period when I was doing a drawing and then doing a painting almost the same size, just flipping back and forth. Surrealism, magic realism. What is that? That's right, it's not a painting. That's a billboard. So, and I tell my students a painting is not a billboard. What I mean by that is a billboard is meant for you to figure out in about a split second when you drive by it. I get it. And you keep on going, right? So a painting, there's much more. This is just my belief. A painting should have more to it. And it also asks the viewer to almost meet the artist halfway. So you have to dig, you have to do a little research, you have to probe what the meaning is. This quote by Degas has haunted me for years. Degas, the great French painter, he said, "A picture demands a certain mystery, vagueness, fantasy. If one dots all the I's, one ends by being boring." So that's haunted me too, because I don't want things to be too obvious. I go back to the Mona Lisa. For 500 years, people have been, wrapped up or they've been captured by the mystery. What does this painting mean? And they're still talking about it. So paintings shouldn't be like a billboard. I think the audience should do some digging. I think you should do some research. But I do like the fact that things are concealed or veiled. Surrealism, if you don't know, is a cultural movement in Europe where painters were influenced by Freud. Sorry about that. Floyd. I've been influenced by Floyd. Yeah. So Salvador Dali, his famous floating, melting clocks. Rene Magritte, his painting of apples, or just taking ordinary things or using the language of art or the language of life. You can take anything, changing scale. The artist has total freedom. I tell my students this, a painting is the only place in a work of art that you have total freedom. You can do whatever you want. There are very few things in life that you can say that have total freedom. You can change scale, you can change the environment. Once you understand the language, you can do pretty much whatever you want. One of my great heroes would have to be Giorgio de Chirico. De Chirico was an Italian surrealist, and you'll see some more of his work. This painting actually is in Toledo, at the Toledo Museum of Art. So paintings like this, The Enigma of the Hour, where I mentioned again about poetry, there's simplicity to the environment, but there's also a mystery. There's a sense of the viewer saying, what's going on? You see the train, you see the statuary, and there's just a sense of day, the long shadows, but it definitely sets a mood, it definitely sets an environment. There's a lot going on there that the viewer is asked to question and to probe and decipher. The mystery and melancholy of the street is another one. Here's a great quote from de Chirico. What is especially needed is great sensitivity to look upon everything in the world as enigma, to live in the world as in an immense museum of strange things. So I think when you start looking at situations, you start looking at environments, maybe a little more subjectively, at least I do, I start to get inspiration. I find inspiration in the strangest places. I mentioned when I had our daughter walking around or driving around or just seeing something or being open to the everyday. So I'm not waiting for, I'm not waiting to force the issue, but I'm actually open to any kind of, anything that moves me, really. It becomes very subjective. This is my painting, Midnight Train, which you can see the obvious influence of de Chirico with the rounded arches and the homes. This was done a couple years ago when I was contemplating middle age. So this is kind of an analogy of that. So you can see the train. I don't know if you can notice it, but there's a number 63 on the train. I was 63 when I did this. And just passing by, and even these homes, how life is going so quickly, you don't know how much of it is left. So there is this sense of melancholy, too, I think, in some of these works. I love still lifes, too. I love doing still lifes. The gallery owner in Chicago calls these tablescapes, which I like that idea, where you can create little worlds. This is actually my interpretation of the Magnificat, where you've got the vase of flowers and the fruit, the message. Or it can be rather ominous, like this, the black horse. Or this one, presents. There's a cup of coffee waiting for you. This also ties into what's called magic realism. And magic realism, I think, is more of a 20th century term. Surrealism was maybe more connected to the French movement, but even though it influences a lot, and as I said, surrealism is tied more to the subconscious, whereas magic realism, if you look at these paintings, like this is by Wisconsin artist John Wilde. John Wilde was a wonderful painter. He taught at the University of Wisconsin. Maybe this could happen, maybe. I mean, maybe you're going to have an antelope and you're going to have a naked lady running through your house. Yeah. I mean, it could happen. And that's said, you're using this simple language. This is a simple one-point perspective painting. And you're setting it up so you're challenging the viewer about what they're seeing. You're pulling their chain a little bit too. But I love that freedom that the artist has. This is another Wilde. I got to know John Wilde. I corresponded with him. He died about 12 years ago, but I actually went up to Wisconsin and visited him. He was a wonderful person. George Tooker was another American artist who studied at the Art Students League. It's a famous painting called The Subway that's at the Whitney. So you can see he's trying, in my interpretation, he's trying to show isolation in the big city. Edward Hopper did the same thing, where you see figures in this big city, but there's still this sense of loneliness and anxiety and separation, definitely separation. But it's beautifully done. It's totally realistic. It's very much like the Renaissance painting I showed you initially with the Raphael. Here's another Tooker, which seems about social commentary, where you've got the government bureau. Who likes going to the DMV? Yeah, so this is, I don't know if you can see this, but the little eyes are looking at you through those windows. And they're all beautifully done. These are actually egg temper paintings. So egg temper was a technique, or was a medium used by a lot of Renaissance artists like Botticelli, where you use dry pigment, you grind it up with water and the yolk of an egg. And the yolk of the egg is the emulsion. Have you ever had egg dry on a plate and it's really hard to scrape off? That's why, because they use that as a binder. So it's a very tough, very long lasting, but it's very difficult because it dries almost immediately when you put a stroke on. So people like Botticelli and Tooker, they would make these out of thousands of little strokes, cross-hatching, just building up this lush, a lush surface, but the color has this radiance too that other kind of paintings don't really have. This is going to be everyone here in a few minutes. I like this painting. I like the guy eating a sandwich too. Another American painter. Who knows Andrew Wyeth? Anybody? Do you know when I teach, I ask my students the first day, I say, in my painting class, right? Painting, who's your favorite? Can anybody name a painter? Nobody raises their hand. Does anybody have no favorite painter? Nobody. Can you name a painter? Nobody. For years, it would be like, because Andrew Wyeth, when I was in art school in the 70s, was a household name. Everybody knew Andrew Wyeth. Nobody knows Andrew Wyeth today. I mean, nobody even says Thomas Kincaid. They used to say, somebody would say, Thomas Kincaid. Somebody actually said Bob Ross. And I said, get out. But anyways, this is a famous painting by Andrew Wyeth, Christina's World. I consider Wyeth a magic realist because he's doing the same thing as Tooker and Wilding. Incredible drafts, incredible handling of light and shadow and figures and dimensional space. But he's setting up these really odd, challenging pictures. This one's kind of creepy, the breakup. Which leads me to another thing you'll see in my work, but also I think it's something that's been compelling to artists for centuries. It's just the idea of the vanitas or memento mori. You probably know that term, but it's an artistic trope that reminds one of the inevitability of death. So when you have death, it kind of frames your life. And for artists, you'll see that Christian and non-Christian. This is an Arnold Böcklin painting where you can see over the artist's shoulder is the skull or the skeleton, whispering in his ear. So this reminder of mortality. This one's for Jeff Proctor. Lou Reed, or you hear it more. You hear a lot in rock music where the sense of death frames a life. Edvard Munch. Last year I turned 65. So I did this painting. It's called Gilded Frame Self-Portrait at 65. And we were at the Art Institute of Chicago looking at the collection the summer before, and I saw myself in one of these beautiful gilded mirrors, and above me was this expanse of darkness. And I started thinking ahead because 65 has always been kind of an ominous age. My father died at 65. And my wife's father died at 65. And I've known a lot of men who've died at 65. There's something very spooky about that. My wife's father and my father had very similar experiences where they worked all their life, they retired, they got sick and died. So it's really sad. But so 65 was hanging over my head. So I did this. And obviously I put this reference to Psalm 90, help us to teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. What you can't see is above in the darkness, I actually painted the number 65. Let me go forward. I don't know if you can see, I took a shot of it from the side. It's varnished, but you can kind of see I took a stencil. And so it's meant to be a memento mori. I actually did that with my class. I teach an advanced painting class, and I made them all do a memento mori. And it's really interesting because, these are young kids. And I asked them, how many of you think of death? And they all raised their hand. Yeah. I was surprised. You see this in nature too, the trumpet vines, my painting, Psalm 103, as for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. So I don't know if you can see this, but in the upper left-hand corner, what do you see? Hummingbird. What do you see in the bottom right-hand corner? Yeah. So the hummingbird's in the upper left, but in the bottom right, there's the reaper. There's a sense of the cutting off, the end, termination, pruning, judgment, maybe. The arsonist. This painting, thanks to Pastor Peterson, this was on the cover of Gottedienst. This is influenced by Luke 12. This is a study for the painting, the arsonist. So have you ever gotten to the point you just want to burn everything down and start over? I have. I felt that way. So I did this painting, or I did this little drawing, and then I was thinking, it was right around the time, and Pastor Peterson actually was on Issues, Etc., talking about the Bible verse. Let's go back. And he was talking about Jesus, and I'm not getting the context wrong, but I believe you said Jesus was going to burn the world down, or just, because he did say this, right? Right. And I started thinking that, well, Jesus is the arsonist. He's going to burn the world down. And that's what this painting is all about. So you can see the figure in the bottom right setting fire to this little Gothic home. The angel of judgment is in the weather vane. It's in low-key colors. It's more of a nocturne. Like this painting is called The Long Way Home. And I was thinking of you are dust, and to dust you shall return. I was also thinking of, obviously, we all have things in our past that we try to bury, but then we dig them up, and it's kind of about the past, so we dig things up, and then we bury them again, or so on. But there's a sense of excavation, digging up. There's a sense of burying again, and this cycle just going back and back again. It does also reference, I think, that we are dust, and life is short. This is an odd one. Cause and effect. This painting. I'm not saying I have visions, but I do have images. I don't know if Ed's the same way. I have these strong images in my head that I jot down and I save for later. This was one of them. I still don't know why I was forced to do this painting or what it even means, but I did think in the process that I always thought this figure to be like Adam. And why would Adam be digging a grave? Well, didn't he have to dig a grave? Yeah. Probably the very first grave ever dug. Bingo. Yeah. Anecdotes. So stories, I'm influenced by stories. This painting was inspired by a story told to us. My wife and I, we have a friend, Susan Applegate, who lived in Michigan, and we visited their home, and they had a large farmhouse, this beautiful farmhouse. And we were walking around, and by the fireplace, there were all these scorch marks. And we said, Susan, what's with the scorch marks? And Susan said, well, my dad every Christmas would take the tree and feed it into the fire. Well, that image stuck in my head. That's what I'm saying. I'm sensitive to things, even the subtlest of things. But a story like that stuck in my head for so long that I just had to do the painting. But it was like 25 years later. I did this just 2 years ago. It's also, I also get the sense, too, at this painting that the little guy watching, even though it was in the story, Susan was a girl, obviously. So I put a little boy, that it's almost like the sins of the father. It's like the things you do that your children see you do. This is a drawing that preceded it, too. This painting is called Yacht Launch. Another story. So my brother-in-law is a wonderful guy. He's a doctor in Seattle. And he was telling us a story about somebody who fixed up this yacht, this historic yacht, and had this big party, had this launch. And at the launch, it caught fire and sunk. And I kind of see it as a companion piece to the arsonist, about not putting too much, value in the treasures of earth, that it's all going to burn up anyways. But it was such a striking image in my mind. So there, what propels you to do an image like this? Well, I kind of can't get it out of my head. There's a compulsion. I think that's the one thing about artists. They're compelled to make art. They're compelled to do these things. So I think that's what separates us probably from anybody else. This is a big painting too. It's 42 by 36. This painting came out of a story too, where recently our daughter moved home. She went through a divorce, and it was whatever. But she brought back a couple pets she had. There were a couple guinea pigs. One of them died. So we had a little committal service, and this is going to sound sacrilegious, but I didn't. I thought, I'm not just going to bury him. Why don't we has anyone done this with a pet? Maybe it's not common, but I thought, well, let's do it. So we went out and dug a hole. I had a plastic bucket, and we read a little service. It may have been an Anglican. I may have found an Anglican service for pets online. There are no Lutheran services for pets. But I did make a little cross I put on his box, and I was just standing there thinking, this is a weird picture. This is, if I could see myself, and again, I'm standing there thinking, and so my daughter does not look like that. That's not me, and that's not my wife. So they're kind of stand-ins. But still, I like the idea of this little kind of sad little party. But I think there is still something kind of poetically beautiful about, the earnestness of these people. It's a fairly recent painting called Tree Baby. This is actually based on a true story. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a tornado, there's destruction, there's a broken tree, and in the middle of the tree, there's a little baby. This actually happened. Wow. This happened, I think, in fall 22. There was a tornado that went through Tennessee, and 150-mile-an-hour winds, and the baby was found inside a tree. It was found in a tree unharmed, just perfectly preserved. Ironically enough, too, the baby's name is Lord, L-O-R-D. Tennessee mom praises God. And again, that's another story you cannot get out of your head. Let me go back to the painting. Yeah, so there's little Lord up there. But I thought of our baptism too. And I may be offline here. I'm not a theologian. Just going to tell you that. But I did think of how the little baby was kept safe, kind of like in the ark of the church. That's in the rite of baptism. And the little guy is unharmed. Standing there like a boss. He's just unscathed. So this other part I want to get into are works that I've done. I've done bulletin art. I think Ed's are fabulous. I've done mine for my church. So St. Paul's is 185 years old. LCMS church here in Fort Wayne, downtown, historic church. And I was approached, I think it was 2013 or so like 11 years ago, by Paul Grimm. Paul said, it was right before Easter, and he said, right before Lent, and he said, can you do some drawings just so we can have something a little more interesting than what we use? So I started doing them at Lent, and I thought, why do I stop here? I'll just keep on going. So I ended up doing, the whole lectionary, the whole 3-year lectionary that St. Paul's mainly uses. So here are a few of them that I've included. The Eye of the Camel. This one is build the silos and eat, drink, and be merry. Yeah. This one's the fig tree, where Jesus said, dig around it, or the parable of the fig tree, dig around it. So again, they're not too obvious, they're a little more subtle. This is a Good Friday version of blood and water. So St. Paul uses these. This is a man burying his treasure. I may end up doing a painting of this in another iteration, another version. This one I like too. This one might come from the 1-year lectionary. Is this in the 1 year? This is where the impure spirit leaves. So this is kind of a play with time. So the demon flies away, but then comes back. So there's a time switch between the two sides. This one is what? What is this one? It rains on the just and the unjust. one of the benefits, or one thing interesting about, I mentioned I was raised Roman Catholic, so I became a Lutheran later in life. And I was really blessed by ministries like Issues, Etc., which I've listened to. Actually, I credit that. I used to be a Baptist. I went from Catholic to Baptist. And I remember listening to Issues, Etc., and I would hear, long gospel, and I think that's what really compelled me. So even in terms of God's providence of landing in Fort Wayne, especially with the seminary and then St. Paul's, my wife and I were friends with Barbara Resch. Richard Resch taught at the seminary for years. Does anybody know Richard? Richard and Barbara. So Barbara invited us to St. Paul's, and because we taught with Barbara. My wife Nancy taught for 34 years at PFW as well. So Barbara invited us to St. Paul's, and we became members, and we still love it. We still are members of St. Paul. What I'm getting to is we're blessed too to know like these seminary profs. So when you think of this parable of the just and the unjust. It's Arthur Just. Yeah, I gave this to Arthur. Arthur has this too, but I couldn't resist. So and Art's actually a neighbor. He lives a block away on our street. This leads me to this. This is my interpretation of the Beatitudes. And so this was from Epiphany, Season A, Epiphany 4. So I try to depict in very small images the Beatitudes. When this year, I think this was 2012, this fell on Super Bowl Sunday, 2014. Yeah, I put this in for Jonathan. So I got a call from Paul Grimm, and Paul said, "Hey, why don't you do a special bulletin cover for the Super Bowl?" And no, just to kind of fake out the pastors. So I did. I did one. I called this the beer attitudes. So instead of a crown of life in the center, you've got the Super Bowl trophy. You've got the icon for the Seahawks and for the Broncos. You've got, who's 18? Of course, Peyton Manning, right? Bullet chips. You've got the Bud. And then you've got Punxsutawney Phil, because it was also Groundhog's Day. So they actually printed, did you get one of these? So they actually printed a few of these. And I still have a copy. And the pastors were, they were very mild. They said, "Oh, this is interesting." We said, "No, you're not going to use that one." But it was fun while it lasted. I mentioned too about Issues, Etc. Did anyone listen to Carl Fickenscher? Carl did a series on it was called Looking Forward to Sunday Morning. So he would do a series on, I think, the Old Testament, the Epistle, and the Gospel readings. Well, Carl is working on a book. This is going to be published. He's been working on it for years. So they're publishing it, and he asked me to use my illustrations. So I'm really honored. Carl is going to be using these. I'm working with CPH. I did not get a cup, by the way. They did not send me a cup. So these are courtesy of CPH. I told them about this talk, and they sent me these, so you can see how it's going to lay out. What I don't understand is Carl's book is going to be 800 pages. No. Carl said he wanted them in 3 volumes. It's going to be one. It's going to be like the New York phone book, right? It's going to be. I'm looking forward to it. I think it comes out next year in 2025. Which leads me to some other works that are a little more overtly Christian, as I call them. I showed you the sign of Jonah. This is a drawing. There's also a drawing that goes with it. I'm obsessed with the story of Jonah. I've used the image and the idea several times. This is a charcoal drawing called The Vine Grower. And this is, where Jonah went out to the city and sat on the east side, made a booth and sat under it, and the Lord prepared a gourd. So basically it's when, he sets up a structure, and I have the vines growing up. And then what happens? God sends a worm, yeah. I love that. God sent a worm. You can't really see it, but there is a little teeny worm in the bottom right. So it's kind of another vanitas in a way, too. Jonah, this one's a little more straightforward. It's the vomiting. And I just love this idea of, I mean, you can't even get any lower than this. You know, if you think about, and also his mission, it's just mind-boggling that he spent 3 days and 3 nights in a fish. He's vomited out. Then he has to get up and preach to a hostile audience. I mean, you must feel totally alone. But you know, he was an effective minister. But anyways, can you see the triangle? There's actually a triangle that's formed. There's a Trinitarian from the tail to the sun to the edge of the spill. So there is an attempt at showing that he's protected, that God is leading him, and so on. This one's called Great with Child. This is another charcoal drawing. I mentioned earlier that a lot of times I'll look at things and say, what if? You know, I mentioned the painting with the tongue horse. So what if you were walking around and saw something valuable? Years ago, one of our associate pastors, Peter Gregory, I don't know if anybody knew Peter, but his wife, Kristen, was pregnant. And she, first child, Mary, and this is 2010. And Kristen would walk up and down the street. I don't know why, but I thought, what if you saw the Holy Family walking up your street? So I did it. So I chose this Tudor home on Kensington Boulevard, and I put Mary and Joseph, Mary's great with child, walking down the street. So just pretty straightforward. It means what it means. This one is also similar. It's pretty much straightforward. Of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. That's Joseph on the left trimming the hedges. But again, there's symmetry. There's a sense of kind of silence and isolation. Mary actually has a book on her lap, and she's looking up intently prior to the visit. This is my version of the prodigal son. This is when he comes to the moment of repentance. So you can see he's holding a bucket. He's looking at the slop he just put down, the pigs. He's actually holding a big zero. It's like he realizes he comes to the bottom. I'm absolutely at rock bottom prior to his repentance. Is it repentance or he just decides to go home? This one is, I did this for Lutheran social services several years ago. This is the Good Samaritan. It's my version of the Good Samaritan. I was honored to do a painting recognizing the 175th anniversary of St. Paul's. And when I met with the committee, you know, things we talked about, one thing was the reredos. They wanted the reredos because it has this beautiful reredos. But an inspiration came from, again, Arthur Just's book, Heaven on Earth. Is anyone familiar with this book? Where he talks about the divine service. And I love this quote. He says, we sometimes think of heaven abstractly as somewhere up there, but heaven is wherever Jesus is. Because Jesus is present among us in the gifts of word and sacrament, then heaven itself is present among us. It is the world of angels, archangels, and all the company of heaven. So the painting I did tries to represent that. So the reredos, you have the communicants around the altar. That's actually a portrait of Pastor Cage on the left and Pastor Gregory, who's since moved on to Massachusetts on the right. And then above you can see, I don't know if you can see, there's a cloud, but there are little, the heavenly hosts, there are people up above, all present. They're supposed to represent during the divine service. And here's a detail, actually at the bottom, if you go directly into the cross, the girl in purple is actually my daughter, then my wife Nancy is to the left, and then I'm to the left of her. So I snuck in a family portrait from the back. Which leads me, last but not least, to the Redeemer Good Friday triptych. So I was approached by Pastor Peterson to consider doing a painting for this new altar. So the new altar, those of you who are members know, and one thing Pastor said was, I want a skull. I want a big skull. And then he called me up and said, no, not a big scope, because then it's going to look like the Pirates of the Caribbean. So we finalized it, and this Romans 5 quote stood out. So what we ended with, and you'll see it upstairs, and this is the study, is a triptych. And a triptych is just 3 paintings. You'll see it a lot in Dutch art, put together. The one shows Adam and Eve. This is the study version where it's a little more revealed. I had to cover them up. The Romans 5 quote, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. And then obviously the skull, and then the expulsion from the garden. So that turned into this. This is the triptych. And I love what Pastor Peterson wrote. I don't know if you've read this or seen this. First of all, it was a donation. The new altar was a donation in acknowledgement of Alex Fries. So I wish my daughter was here because she was actually a friend of Alex. But I love it stands for the testimony of the victory Jesus won for all mankind. And then Pastor writes about the altar itself, and then goes on a little more descriptively. The first panel depicts the fall, where one man's sin entered the world. If you notice, they're eating grapes. So the forbidden fruit has been rendered as grapes. There was I'm reading, the patristic idea that grape trees were cursed at the fall, reduced from trees reaching towards heaven to vines that must crawl upon the earth like snakes. Grapevines are hung upon trellises like Christ upon the cross. That was really wonderful. That was Pastor Peterson. He said, hey, grapes. Then the center one is a little more obvious. So he got his skull. There's his skull. Less Pirates of the Caribbean. And then you probably, maybe you don't know, but the altar is covered all year, except on Maundy Thursday when the altar is stripped and then the painting is revealed until the Easter Vigil, I believe. Which actually, that oddly appealed to me, that the work would not be seen, that you had to use your imagination. You knew it was under there, most of the year, but you couldn't see it. That actually really somehow triggered me. And then with this one, that was accidental about the X. What did you say? Yeah. If you look in the bottom left, there's that, and you can see there's a sprout growing, says Pastor Peterson, there's a sprout growing from a stump whose shape and shadow are in the form of St. Andrew's cross. The sprout is a nod to Eve's seed and also a reminder of Isaiah 11:1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. That was providence. Any questions? Pastor Proctor.
Yeah, the center panel, was the absence of the mandible intentional?
Sort of. Let me go back. Sort of in the sense that I have a plastic skull I use for reference. It didn't have one, so it's
Often art today is portrayed as transgressive, meaning that it's violating rules, and artists seek to do that. A striking feature that you highlighted that I see very evidently is your symmetry. And I'm struck that perhaps you as an artist are transgressing the artistic expectation of dissymmetry, of a lack of symmetry. You're sort of, it seems to me, poking your professional colleagues in the eye a bit with your own use of symmetry. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think all artists are somewhat subversive. You don't want to kind of kick against the pricks, as King James says. You want to fight back. But I'm not trying to be radical in any way. It may be subtle, but it's not too overt. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.